Hello and welcome back to the channel. Have you ever wondered why some organizations run like well-oiled machines, while others feel chaotic? Well, the answer lies in organizational theory. Today, we're diving into the foundation of organizational management, the classical and neoclassical theories. These ideas, which have been developed over a century ago, still shape how we work today. So with that said, let's get started. Let us begin with the classical organizational theory. The classical organizational theory is the bedrock of organizational management thought. Emerging in the early 20th century, these studies concentrated entirely on the formal features of the organization. This refers to the structure, the rules, and the procedures. The core purpose was simple. It aimed to establish the ideal structural concepts that would maximize management efficiency and productivity goals. Within the classical organizational theory, there are three modules. These are created by their three key figures respectively, Frederick Taylor, Henry Fayol, and Max Weber. Let us start with scientific management, also known as Taylorism. This is due to their founder having the last name Taylor. So Frederick W. Taylor initiated the modern management period. This is because he criticized wasted effort and inefficiency in factories of the late 19th century. To Taylor, the organization must be seen as a pragmatic or efficient machine, which is focused purely on doing things as efficiently or as quickly but effectively as possible. So his famous or core premise is finding the, in quotes, one best way to perform every task, and this is found out through careful scientific analysis, thereby leading to the standardization, specialization, and planning of work. This is because once you find the one best way, the idea is that you can then make sure that everyone in that organization does that thing in that one best way, and you can plan around that way. Basically, it's like there is that one golden key towards making an organization as efficient as possible. So he did this through time and motion studies. This is basically the systematic observation and measurement of the time and manner in which a task is performed. So by observing how quickly and how well someone performs a certain task, one then can determine the optimal or best sequence to do that task. So for example, instead of letting a factory worker rely on a habit, for example of putting in one book at a time inside the box, a company implemented Taylorism and used a time and motion study to scientifically measure every step. And so they noticed that, for example, instead of a worker putting one book at a time in a box, the worker can get a bunch of books and put it in the box all at the same time. They then train that worker to use that much better, more optimized sequence to maximize output. Now, let us move forward to administrative management, which was founded or proposed by Henry Fayol. So historically, Henry Fayol, a French engineer, focused on the overall structure and management of the organization as the whole, rather than the previous theory which focused on the individual worker and their emotions. And so the core idea is that Fayol provided a universal theory focusing more on what managers do, proposing methods to synchronize internal processes from the top down. So technically, Fayol focused on management and how managers can best be efficient and effective. So the key contributions that Fayol gave us are two critical frameworks that are still taught today. These are known as the 5 functions of management and the 14 principles of management. So let us start with the 5 functions of management. So these specifically describe the manager's job or what is expected of them to do. So the first of which is planning. So this is basically forecasting future operations and developing a strategy. So for example, a manager is creating next quarter's strategy, thinking of how many workers it could possibly need or how turnovers would possibly be, and so what would be the best strategy in order for them to meet that need. The next function is organizing. This is all about mobilizing the human and material resources to execute the plan. So for example, the manager has determined that they need this amount of staff in order for them to meet the plan that they have devised. And so organizing is hiring that staff and allocating the necessary necessary equipment in order for them to achieve the plan. The next function is commanding. This is basically guiding and leading the employees to do their job. So this can be seen in daily meetings where a supervisor is clearly instructing the team on their daily tasks. The next task is coordinating. This is all about harmonizing activities among all departments. So for example, a manager is ensuring the marketing and production teams align in their schedules. Finally, the last function is controlling. This is all about checking outcomes against the initial plan and taking corrective action. So for example, a manager would review the monthly performance report and check if it meets the budget. And based on what the priorities are in the company, for example, they are quite low on budget. If someone's monthly performance is not doing so well, they could let go of that person in order for the company to meet their priorities. Now let us go over the 14 principles of management. These are the rules for basically managing effectively. So the first of which is the division of work. This is basically the idea that specialization increases efficiency. So this can be seen where an accountant only handles finance tasks, a receptionist only handles front desk tasks, and so on. The next principle is authority and responsibility. This is basically the idea that management has the right to give orders, and they are also balanced by accountability. So for example, a supervisor has the authority to delegate to their staff, but in the end, they are the ones responsible for the result of the task because they were the ones who delegated and ultimately monitored their employee. The next principle is discipline. This is all about the respect for the organizational rules. So a management must make sure that all employees consistently follow safety protocols, for example. The next principle is unity of command. An employee must receive orders from only one superior. This is in order for there to be no confusion on who to report to. So for example, if you were an employee, you would report only to your direct manager. The next principle is unity of direction. This means that there should only be one head and one plan for activities having the same objective. So for example, in a project, all product development teams must work from a single approved blueprint and all report ideally to one superior. The next principle is subordination of individual interest to general interest. In other words, this basically means that organizational interest comes first over personal interest. So this would mean that in management, it is much better for you to postpone a personal vacation when the company needs you for a critical project. The next principle, which could then make the other previous principle a bit better, is remuneration, which basically refers to the payment that should be fair to both employees and the organization. So this could make that previous principle a bit better if you're not the type to want to sacrifice your personal interests. Remuneration would then argue that because you are postponing a personal vacation, you should be offered a fair and proper salary due to your postponement and your personal, in quotes, sacrifice. And so an example of this would be offering competitive salaries based on industry standards and how much commitment your role dictates. The next principle is centralization. So this is basically the degree to which authority is concentrated at the top. So for example, in a large scale, strategic decisions are made only by the CEO. The next principle is scalar chain. So this means that the formal line of authority should be traced from top to bottom. So for example, communication is strictly following the reporting structure. You as an employee cannot go and communicate directly to the CEO. You have to first directly communicate to your manager, and then your manager will communicate, let's say, to a middle manager, then to a top line manager, then to a CEO, something like that. The next principle is order. This means that there should be a specific place for everything and everyone. So this means both in a material order and a social order. So an example for this in a material sense is that all tools should be labeled and stored in their proper place. And in a social way, that could be that employees should stay within their own departmental cubicles or areas. The next principle is equity. This is the idea that managers should be kind and fair to subordinates. So for example, this means treating all employees justly and impartially in disciplinary matters. You should not be biased in a way. The next principle is stability of tenure of personnel. So basically, the idea is that as as much as possible, your employees should stay there. Low employee turnover is the goal or is desirable. So this could be done, for example, by providing job security to retain experienced talent. The next principle is initiative. This is all about encouraging employees to propose and execute new ideas. So an example of this is allowing a team to pitch a unique solution to a long-standing problem. And finally, the last principle is esprit de corps, or I believe it's esprit de corps, since this is a French term which is all about promoting team spirit, harmony, and unity. So for example, management can host team building activities in order to foster collaboration. Finally, the last core theory in the classical organizational theory trinity is bureaucratic management. This is founded by Max Weber, who is a journal sociologist who provided the definitive model of a formal, rational organization. So the main idea of Weber, which may seem similar to the others, is all about bureaucracy as the ideal form of organization. So bureaucracy is based on rational legal authority, or in other words, based on rules and laws. So his goal was to increase productivity by maximizing structure and eliminating personal bias, which could affect things such as nepotism, for example. So the key principles here are basically a well-defined authority hierarchy, which you may find similar to the previous theory, specialization of labor, which is similar to Taylorism in a way, formal rules and procedures, and I believe this may be the big emphasis of it, which could make it the standout characteristic, which is impersonality, which is basically the idea that actions are based on logical reasoning, not emotions nor relationships, which are outside of the organization. So this could be best seen with an example. So for example, when a government agency hires a new staff member, the selection process is based purely on merit. So this is based on strict qualifications or competitive exams to determine the skill of the applicant, in order for them to ensure impartiality and eliminate any personal favoritism. So, the classical theory established the three models for structure and efficiency, but how did these ideas translate into the actual rules for building an organization? This leads us to the four major structural principles. So formally, these are known as the four major structural principles of classical theory. So these principles guide the design of an efficient, goal-oriented organization. The first of which is the functional principle. This is the concept behind the division of labor. It states that organizations should be divided into specialized units that perform similar functions. So this is how the organization structures itself horizontally, which is based on what tasks are performed. So an example of this would be, instead of one person handling everything, a manufacturing company separates its operations into a purchasing department, a production department, and a shipping department. So each unit specializes, allowing for greater efficiency and expertise within that specific function. The counterpart of this is the scalar principle. So this deals this time with the organizational vertical growth and refers to the chain of command that grows with the levels added. So it basically is linked to hierarchy of authority. So unity of command is the key component here, ensuring that each worker has one superior. So it is focused again vertically, clarifying the path of authority and communication. So for example, if a machine operator needs a decision, they first report to the foreman, who then reports to the shift supervisor, who then reports to the plant manager, and so on. So communication must follow this strict scalar chain up and down the organizational ladder, not skipping any rungs in order for there to be a certain level of organization. The next principle is the line-staff principle. That's line/staff principle. So it's two different words. So this principle differentiates job roles based on their contribution to the organization's main goals. So what is the difference between a line and a staff function? So if we want to put it in keywords, line function is about the primary responsibility. Meanwhile, staff functions are the subsidiary support. So line functions are directly involved involved in achieving the core mission. So let's say in Uniqlo, which is a retail company, their main core mission is to produce clothes and sell them. So the line functions there would be product creation and sales. Meanwhile, the staff functions are supportive, advisory, or specialized roles that aid the line function. So this can include HR or legal work. So for example, in a software company, the developers are the line because they create the product. Meanwhile, the human resources is the staff, providing crucial support by recruiting and managing personnel. Finally, the last principle is about span of control. This refers to the number of subordinates a manager is responsible for supervising. So the keywords you would see here is tall versus flat structure. So what's the difference between them? Well, ultimately, span of control determines the number of layers in the organization. A small span, which has few subordinates per manager, creates a tall organization with more managers. So you can imagine it like a tall rectangle that is standing up. Meanwhile, a large span creates a flat one with fewer layers because a manager can now control or supervise more subordinates. So, for example, a retail store manager is overseeing 20 floor associates, has then a large span of control, which is a flat structure. Because if you can imagine it, if there's 2 floors, there is one manager in the top floor, and there are the 20 floor associates at the bottom floor. And so because there are so many associates at that bottom floor, if you try to draw it out, it becomes like a rectangle which is lying down, and so it's a flat structure. Conversely, let's say there is a medtech company and a lab director is supervising only 3 highly specialized research scientists, and so they have a small span of control. Why is this the case? Because if you think about it now, this is easier to visualize if there's more of them. So let's say another example could be, let's say the US Army, which has a small span of control and a tall structure, because it starts with, say, and forgive me because I'm not really good with this, let's say there's the commander, then under the commander there's a couple of generals, and then under the couple of generals there's just a couple of sergeants, and so on. So there's many levels, which makes it tall, but they oversee only specific people, small amounts of people. At least in this case, let's just focus on the higher levels of military, not the bigger levels. So since they are focusing on just a small amount of subordinates, there is that narrow span of control. And because there are multiple levels in the military, it eventually grows into this tall structure because you go up the ranks, so to speak. So now, as powerful as classical theory was for structuring organizations, it had a major blind spot, which is acknowledging the human aspect of being. So this is where neoclassical thinkers stepped in to revolutionize how we look at work. So historically, as we moved into the mid-20th century, people realized that the classical approach was too cold. It was mechanistic and ignored a huge part of the equation, which is the human element. So this realization led to the neoclassical theory, which is an update to the original ideas. So this is building on top of it, not necessarily dismissing the classical principles and ideas. So neoclassical theory is also known as the human relations or behavioral theory of organization. And so the primary contribution of the neoclassical approach was the emphasis on individual or group behavior in social or human relationships. So they introduced the concept of the informal organization. So this refers to the social structure, the friendships, and the unwritten rules that exist alongside the formal structure. So this shift was cemented by the famous Hawthorne experiments by Elton Mayo. So the study found that worker productivity was influenced less by physical factors like lighting and more by social factors and the feeling of being valued and observed. And so the whole idea from that experiment was that by receiving personal, intimate attention from the researchers, since they were observing the workers, it boosted their efficiency and productivity. And so this finding, driven by a sense of perhaps feeling the attention and thereby having that sense of belonging, was more consequential or more impactful in determining productivity than simple changes in economic incentives like money or lighting or basic compensation, which was the focus of the previous classical theory. In this case, the work group's social dynamics often dictated the efficiency and the production pace. So this now brings us to the key principles, this time of the neoclassical approach. So the neoclassical theory introduced key principles to put the focus back on the people. So the first of which is focusing on the individual. This is all about recognizing that the worker is a distinct social being, not a mechanical tool. In other words, they realized or recognized at least that humans are not robots. Humans have aspirations beyond just economic and security. The next principle is the work group. This is highlighting the importance of the social factors of work groups that operate within a formal organization. This is basically debunking the concept that who they are working with, who are they surrounded with doesn't matter, when in fact, at least according to the neoclassical approach, it does, and it affects their productivity and efficiency. Finally is participative management. So this is about allowing workers to participate in the decision-making process to ensure increases in productivity. While this is acknowledged in some theories in classical approach, I suppose in neoclassical approach this is placed more emphasis on giving human autonomy, recognizing the social being here in order for them to become more efficient and more empowered due to the recognition again that belongingness and attention are important and do affect a worker's efficiency. And so you may be asking, what is the difference between classical theory and neoclassical theory? Well, in a nutshell, classical theory focuses heavily on the work, optimizing the task itself, how it's done. Meanwhile, neoclassical theory focuses on the workers, so their morale, their social needs, and their psychological well-being, looking at the human. And that's it for the video. Thank you so much again for watching. If you'd like to see more, feel free to check out the playlist link here or check out the full psychological review course. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a comment in order for us to help push this video through the algorithm. And please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do not miss any uploads. Thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye!